In the glittering heart of Las Vegas, under the lights of Caesar's palace, a brash fighter was about to push his mockery too far. A night of sport turned volatile when Bill Superfoot Wallace taunted tradition, humiliating his opponent and daring Chuck Norris himself to respond. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical Hollywood star. For years, he was the undefeated karate world champion, the man who brought Tang Soo Do into the global spotlight, feared for his ability to end fights before they began. When Wallace jeered and pointed his challenge at Norris, he had no idea he was provoking a storm. Norris's silent step forward was a strategic response that would trigger a confrontation the cameras and the martial arts world would replay for generations. What began as a showboater's exhibition would become a crucible of respect and reckoning. The Las Vegas arena would never forget the night arrogance collided with mastery and Wallace's swagger collapsed in silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Caesar's Palace Grand Arena hummed with anticipation. Las Vegas, 1979. A city built on spectacle, now hosting the year's most talked-about martial arts exhibition. Overhead, spotlights swept across the packed crowd, illuminating faces eager for violence dressed as sport. Television cameras rolled, their operators jostling for position around the elevated ring. Combat sports were riding a new wave of mainstream interest, and the promoters had spared no expense. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed through speakers, bouncing off the gilded ceiling. Tonight, we bring you the finest martial artists in America. His voice peaked with practiced drama as the crowd roared. In the third row, just beyond the press section, sat Chuck Norris. Unlike the shouting spectators around him, he remained still a study in composed vigilance. At 40, Norris had already become a legend. Six-time world karate champion, Hollywood's newest action star, and the man credited with bringing traditional karate into America's combat consciousness. Tonight, he wore a simple black blazer over a white shirt, no tie. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes alert but relaxed, observing rather than judging. And now, the announcer continued, the man everyone came to see undefeated in 23 professional bouts, the fastest kicker in the world, Bill Superfoot Wallace. The arena erupted as Wallace bounded into view, arms raised in preemptive victory. At 33, Wallace represented a new breed of fighter, flashy, media-savvy, and unapologetically cocky. His nickname Superfoot came from a left leg that could deliver kicks with blinding speed. A weapon he'd famously refined after a knee injury ended his judo career. Unlike Norris's traditional gi, Wallace wore custom-made fighting shorts with Superfoot emblazoned across the waistband. Wallace played to the crowd, throwing high kicks that sliced the air inches from the faces of front-row spectators who recoiled, then cheered. He spun, flexed, pointed at cameras, a natural showman who understood entertainment value as much as combat technique. "This guy's something else," murmured a sports reporter seated nearby. "Changed the game completely." Norris made no comment, though his gaze remained fixed on Wallace, noting every flourish, every unnecessary movement. The announcer introduced Wallace's opponent, James Slayton, a 43-year-old karate master from California with a distinguished competitive record that had recently shown signs of decline. Slayton entered with dignity, a traditional bow to the four corners, a respectful nod to the officials. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, though the lines around his eyes deepened when Wallace mock yawned during his introduction. "Old school meets new school tonight, folks," the announcer declared. "Traditional karate facing the future of American kickboxing." As Slayton and Wallace met at the center for instructions, Wallace grinned, and whispered something that made Slayton's jaw tighten. Norris noted this exchange without expression, his only movement the slow tap of one finger against his knee. Around him, the crowd had formed factions, older martial artists and purists who clapped respectfully for Slayton, younger fans whistling and hooting for Wallace. The generational divide was palpable, the arena splitting between respect for tradition and hunger for something new and explosive. The referee stepped back. The bell rang. Wallace circled immediately, bouncing on the balls of his feet, hands low, almost inviting attack. Slayton moved more deliberately, hands high in traditional karate guard. For 30 seconds, they measured distance, Wallace occasionally feinting, smirking when Slayton reacted. "Come on, old man," Wallace called, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Show me this karate everyone used to talk about." Slayton remained disciplined, ignoring the taunt. He stepped forward with a textbook front kick that Wallace easily evaded. "Telegraphing," Wallace laughed, dancing backward. "They still teach that at the senior center?" This drew chuckles from Wallace's supporters. Slayton pressed forward with a combination. Punch, punch, kick, traditional, precise, but lacking the explosiveness of his younger years. Wallace slipped each strike effortlessly. Near the press section, a photographer whispered to his colleague, "This ain't gonna last long." Norris heard the comment, but remained focused on the technical aspects unfolding before him. He noted how Slayton maintained proper form despite Wallace's mockery, how the older fighter conserved energy, while Wallace burned it with unnecessary movement. But he also saw the telltale signs of a fighter past his prime. The split-second delay between thought and execution, the slightly labored breathing after combinations. 5 minutes into the exhibition, Wallace had yet to throw a serious strike, content to make Slayton chase him while pointing out each missed attempt to the crowd. "Too slow," he'd call. Or, "My grandmother moves faster." Each comment drew louder laughter. Each laugh seemed to wound Slayton more than any physical blow could. Finally, Wallace stopped retreating. He planted his feet and beckoned Slayton forward with both hands. "All right. Time to actually fight. Show me what you got, sensei." Slayton, frustration finally overcoming discipline, charged forward with a lunging punch. Wallace's counter came with devastating speed. A left roundhouse kick that connected just below Slayton's ear. The crack echoed through the arena. Slayton staggered but didn't fall. "That's one," Wallace announced to the crowd, circling again. "Let's see if he can take two." Norris leaned forward slightly. His first significant movement since the match began. His eyes narrowed as he watched Slayton struggle to regain composure. "That man should stop this fight," Norris said quietly. To no one in particular. A reporter glanced over. "Did you say something, Chuck?" But Norris had already returned to silence, his focus absolute as Wallace closed in for the finish. Slayton shook his head, trying to clear the fog from Wallace's first clean strike. The arena lights seemed suddenly brighter. The crowd noise distorted. Across the ring, Wallace bounced from foot to foot, playing to the cameras, his smile wide and predatory. "Ready for more, old-timer?" Wallace called, loud enough for the microphones to catch. The announcer's voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're seeing why they call him Superfoot." That kick was clocked at over 60 miles per hour in training. Slayton reset his stance, summoning what dignity remained. For 30 years, he had lived by the code of traditional karate respect, discipline, perseverance. Now, those values seemed hollow against Wallace's raw effectiveness. Still, he wouldn't quit. He moved forward again, more cautiously this time. In the third row, Chuck Norris watched with growing concern. He recognized what most spectators couldn't see. Slayton's subtle disorientation, the uneven weight distribution, the delayed reactions, the signs of a concussion were beginning to show. Wallace circled left, hands provocatively low. "Come on. I'll even give you a free shot. Right here." He pointed to his chin. When Slayton didn't immediately attack, Wallace rolled his eyes theatrically. Performance anxiety? Happens to guys your age. The crowd's laughter rolled through the arena. Slayton's face flushed with humiliation beneath the bruise forming on his temple. He launched a combination front kick, reverse punch textbook technique but lacking the speed to threaten Wallace. Superfoot slipped the kick and caught the punch on his forearm. In the same fluid motion, he delivered 3 rapid strikes, a jab to the nose, a hook to the liver, and another roundhouse kick that connected with Slayton's jaw. The sound was sickening, bone and flesh yielding to focused impact. Slayton dropped heavily, face first onto the canvas. The referee rushed in, waving his arms. Medical staff scrambled through the ropes before Slayton had stopped moving. "Is he breathing?" Someone yelled from the crowd. The arena fell into uneasy silence as the medics worked. Slayton stirred after 15 seconds that felt like hours, rolling onto his side. A collective sigh of relief swept through the spectators. Wallace, meanwhile, had already moved to the corner of the ring. He flexed for a photographer, then raised his arms in triumph as if he'd won a championship rather than an exhibition match against an aging opponent. When the crowd's reaction came more subdued than he expected, Wallace grabbed a microphone from the announcer's table. "That, ladies and gentlemen," he proclaimed, "is the difference between real fighting and playing karate." He strutted around the ring's perimeter as Slayton was helped to his feet. "No offense to the dinosaurs, but the meteor has landed." This drew mixed reactions, cheers from younger fans, uncomfortable murmurs from martial arts traditionalists. Slayton was guided to his corner, eyes unfocused, leaning heavily on his cornerman. "We've got a real barn burner tonight, folks," Wallace continued, microphone in hand, clearly enjoying the spotlight. "Anyone else want to step up?" "I've barely broken a sweat." Chuck Norris remained motionless, his expression unreadable as Wallace basked in the aftermath of his victory. Around him, reporters scribbled notes, photographers clicked away, and fans alternately cheered and booed. But Norris focused solely on Slayton, the defeated fighter's glazed eyes, the trembling hands, the struggle to maintain consciousness. Wallace wasn't finished. He approached Slayton's corner, microphone still in hand. "No hard feelings, right, Teach?" That's why they invented retirement homes. He reached out as if to shake Slayton's hand, then pulled back with a laugh when Slayton instinctively raised his arm. Too slow again. The medical staff shot Wallace a disapproving look as they applied ice to Slayton's swelling jaw. Wallace shrugged and turned back to the crowd, soaking in the atmosphere. Some fans began to chant, "Superfoot! Superfoot!" But others had grown uncomfortable with the display. A woman in the second row stood up and shouted, "Show some respect!" Others nodded in agreement. Wallace seemed to feed on both the admiration and the disapproval, playing to all sides of the arena as Slayton was finally helped through the ropes and led backstage. The ring announcer tried to regain control of the program. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next exhibition will begin in 15 minutes. But Wallace wasn't ready to surrender the microphone or the spotlight. He waved off the announcer and continued his victory lap around the ring. That's when his gaze fell on Chuck Norris, sitting impassively in the third row. Wallace's smile widened. He pointed directly at Norris. Well, he said, his voice echoing through the speakers. If it isn't the movie star himself." A ripple of recognition spread through the crowd. Heads turned toward Norris, who remained seated, expression unchanged. "Chuck Norris, ladies and gentlemen," Wallace announced, playing ringmaster. "Hollywood's favorite karate man. Tell me, Chuck, was that too violent for the cameras? Should I have pulled my kicks for the censors? The spotlight swung from the ring to Norris. He didn't blink in its glare, didn't shift in his seat. His stillness seemed to intensify under observation. Wallace leaned against the ropes, microphone clutched tight. "What's the matter, Chuck? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just saving your lines for the next script?" Throughout the arena, a tension began to build, a sense that something unplanned and dangerous was unfolding. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Cameras pivoted toward Norris. The crowd's noise diminished to a low murmur of anticipation. Wallace, emboldened by Norris's silence, pressed further. "You know, folks, there's a big difference between movie karate and the real thing." He gestured around the ring. "This here? This is real. No second takes. No stunt doubles." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd. Most eyes remained fixed on Norris, waiting for his response. But the karate champion remained still, his gaze level, neither rising to the bait nor retreating from it. The standoff lingered, stretching into uncomfortable territory. Wallace, perhaps sensing he needed to escalate to provoke a reaction, turned to face Norris directly. "Tell you what, Chuck," he said, voice dripping with mock courtesy. "Why don't you come up here and show us all what traditional karate really looks like? Unless you're worried about messing up that movie star face." The challenge hung in the air like a thundercloud. In the stillness that followed, something shifted in Chuck Norris's eyes, not anger, but a calm, focused intensity that seemed to lower the temperature in the arena by several degrees. "I'm talking to you, Norris!" Wallace called out, his voice slightly higher than before, betraying a hint of frustration at Chuck's continued silence. "What's your style again? Tang Soo Do? Looks more like Tang Soo Don't from where I'm standing." The crude joke drew scattered laughter, but most of the audience remained uncomfortably silent, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Cameras swiveled between Wallace in the ring and Norris in his seat, capturing the growing tension for television viewers across the country. Wallace paced along the ropes, microphone gripped tight, doubling down on his challenge. "For those who don't know," he addressed the crowd, "Mr. Norris here claims to be a world champion. But that was what, 10 years ago? Ancient history." He pointed directly at Norris again. "The game's changed, Chuck. While you've been playing pretend fights for the cameras, real fighters like me have been evolving the sport." In the press section, reporters exchanged glances. This wasn't part of the night's program. This was raw, unscripted confrontation unfolding before their eyes. One whispered to another, "Wallace is either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," came the reply. Chuck Norris remained perfectly still, his breathing unchanged, his gaze steady and direct. Unlike Slayton, whose face had revealed every emotion, Norris's expression gave nothing away. Not anger, not annoyance, not even interest, just calm, penetrating awareness. Wallace, perhaps unnerved by this unshakable composure, escalated further. "Your silence speaks volumes, Chuck. Is that what you teach your students? When challenged, just sit there?" He gestured to the bloody canvas where Slayton had fallen. "Your buddy tried that approach. Didn't work out too well for him." At the mention of Slayton, something subtle changed in Norris's demeanor. No movement, no expression shift, but a certain quality of his stillness intensified like air before lightning strikes. An older martial artist seated near Norris muttered, "He shouldn't have gone there." Wallace, missing these subtle cues, pressed his advantage. "Here's what I think, folks. I think Mr. Hollywood here knows exactly what would happen if he stepped into this ring with me. Same thing that happens when fantasy meets reality. Reality wins. Every time." Throughout the arena, a new chant began to form, starting with a few voices and growing stronger. "Chuck! Chuck. Chuck. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Wallace heard it, and scoffed into the microphone. You people want to see him up here? Trust me. He doesn't want that. His career's built on carefully edited footage and camera tricks. He pointed at his own face. Unmarked, despite the evening's combat. This is real fighting, folks. No cuts, no bruises because my opponent never touched me. The chanting grew louder. Chuck! 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 Wallace shook his head, playing to the crowd. Fine. Fine. Let's make it official. He cleared his throat dramatically. Chuck Norris, I'm formally inviting you to step into this ring right now. He smiled. All teeth and challenge. Show us all whether Tang Soo Do works against someone who won't let you win. Someone who hasn't memorized the choreography. The arena held its collective breath. Even the most casual spectators understood the gravity of the moment, a young champion publicly challenging a legend, questioning not just his current relevance, but the very foundation of his martial arts philosophy. For the first time since Wallace began his taunting, Chuck Norris moved. It was a small movement, just a slight adjustment of his posture, but it rippled through the arena like a stone dropped in still water. He placed both hands on his knees, perfectly symmetrical. Wallace noticed and grinned wider. Look at that, folks. I think he's considering it. He bounced on his toes, spinning a flashy kick for the cameras. Don't think too long, Chuck. Offer expires when I leave this ring. The chanting had become a roar. Chuck! 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 Norris stood. The simple action silenced the arena so completely that the sound of his chair folding closed echoed audibly. He rose without hurry or ceremony, a fluid, economical movement that spoke of thousands of hours of disciplined practice. His face remained calm, eyes never leaving Wallace. He removed his jacket, folded it precisely, and handed it to a wide-eyed attendant. Beneath it, he wore a simple white shirt that revealed forearms corded with lean muscle. No flashy attire. No announcement of his presence, just quiet, deliberate movement toward the ring. Wallace's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning brighter than ever. Well, well. Look who decided to join the party. His voice carried a forced joviality that hadn't been there moments before. Someone, get a liability waiver for Mr. Norris to sign. But Norris was already at the ring steps, ascending with the same measured pace. A path had cleared before him without anyone being asked to move. The crowd's chanting had transformed into a hushed, electric silence. The collective held breath of 3,000 people, witnessing something they instinctively understood was historic. The ring official looked uncertain, glancing between Norris and the promoter at ringside, silently asking for guidance. The promoter, recognizing the marketing goldmine unfolding before him, gave a quick nod. The official stepped aside, allowing Norris to enter through the ropes. Norris stepped onto the canvas, where Slayton's blood was still visible in dark smears. He moved to the center of the ring, stopped, and stood with hands relaxed at his sides. No stance. No guard. Nothing that signaled fighting intention, just presence. Wallace, 20 feet away, shifted his weight from foot to foot. The microphone suddenly looked awkward in his hand. He passed it to the ring official, then addressed Norris directly. Didn't think you'd actually do it. His voice carried in the silent arena without amplification. But since you're here, he gestured expansively to the crowd. Let's give these good people their money's worth. Norris remained still, his gaze level and unwavering. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet carried to every corner of the hushed arena. You've dishonored this ring enough tonight. 5 words. Spoken not in anger, but as simple fact. They landed with more impact than any physical blow Wallace had delivered all evening. The crowd's silence deepened at Norris's words. No one moved. Even the television cameras seemed to hold steady, operators forgetting to adjust their frames as the moment stretched. Wallace's smile flickered, uncertainty crossing his face for the first time all evening. Big talk from a man who makes his living pretending to fight. Wallace recovered, his voice carrying a defensive edge now. He began circling slowly, bouncing on the balls of his feet, movement for movement's sake, perhaps to mask his sudden discomfort. Norris remained motionless at the center of the ring, his posture neither aggressive nor defensive, simply present. His eyes tracked Wallace without his head moving, an economy of motion that spoke of decades of discipline. In the press section, veteran sports reporter Martin Kelly leaned forward, pen poised over his notepad. He'd covered boxing and martial arts for 23 years, witnessed the rise and fall of dozens of champions. But something about this moment felt different. This wasn't about titles or purses. This was about something older, something fundamental. We doing this? Or what? Wallace called. Louder now, playing to the crowd again. Or did you just come up here to lecture me? He threw a flashy spinning kick at the air, stopping inches from where Norris would have been had he stepped forward. Boom! That would have been credits rolling if this was one of your movies. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, but most remained silent, transfixed by the unfolding drama. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been starker. Wallace, all motion and noise; Norris, absolute stillness and silence. From his seat near the tunnel, Slayton watched, holding an ice pack to his swollen jaw. Though still dazed from Wallace's earlier assault, he wouldn't miss this for anything. His cornerman had tried to get him to the hospital, but Slayton had refused. I need to see this, he'd insisted. Now, as he watched Norris standing perfectly composed before the man who had humiliated him, a sense of vindication began to grow. The ring official approached hesitantly. Harold Mack had refereed hundreds of fights, but nothing in the rulebook prepared him for this situation. This wasn't scheduled. There were no signed contracts, no medical clearances, no commission approvals. Yet something in Norris's demeanor told him that regulatory concerns were secondary to what was unfolding here. Gentlemen, this isn't on the program. If you want to continue, I need to review the rules. No rules, Wallace interrupted. Exhibition, right? We're just giving the people what they want. He gestured to the crowd, seeking their approval, but the response was muted, uncertain. Norris addressed the official without taking his eyes off Wallace. This won't take long. Something in his tone, not menacing, but matter of fact, sent a ripple through the arena. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Photographers positioned themselves for better angles. The crowd, sensing something momentous, collectively inched closer to the edge of their seats. In the front row, Hollywood producer Michael Benton fumbled for his Rolodex, already envisioning the movie rights. 2 seats down, talent agent Ray Hoffman assessed the marketing potential, mentally calculating endorsement values. But most spectators weren't thinking about business opportunities. They were simply witnessing something authentic in a city built on artifice. Wallace's coach called from the corner, Bill, maybe we should schedule this properly. No, Wallace cut him off. He's here now. I'm here now. His smile returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Unless Chuck's having second thoughts. Norris remained silent, his stillness a stark counterpoint to Wallace's nervous energy. Under the harsh arena lights, the differences between them became more pronounced. Wallace, at 33, was the embodiment of the new generation, flashy, outspoken, media-savvy. Norris, at 40, represented something more traditional, disciplined, reserved, focused on substance over spectacle. The ring official looked between them, then to the promoter, who nodded emphatically, clearly seeing dollar signs in this unexpected confrontation. With visible reluctance, the official stepped back. "Keep it clean, gentlemen." As the official moved away, time seemed to slow. The ambient noise of the arena, the murmurs, the air conditioning hum, the distant clinking of glasses at the bar, all faded into a strange, suspended silence. In that vacuum, Wallace and Norris existed in perfect contrast: motion versus stillness, youth versus experience, arrogance versus humility. Wallace immediately settled into his fighting stance, weight on his back leg, hands high, the posture that had made him famous. "No referee to save you, Chuck. Just you and me." For the first time since entering the ring, Norris moved. It was a subtle shift, right foot sliding back half an inch, weight distributing evenly, hands rising slightly. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, yet somehow transformative. He wasn't just standing anymore. He was ready. The change was so minimal, yet so profound, that a murmur ran through the crowd. Those with martial arts experience recognized it immediately, the difference between a man standing and a master preparing to move. In the third row, Master Tanaka, a 70-year-old karate instructor who had traveled from San Francisco for the exhibition, nodded almost imperceptibly. He had trained with Norris years ago, had witnessed the Americans' dedication to the traditional aspects of martial arts when many were abandoning them for flashier, more marketable styles. Now, watching Norris assume his stance, Tanaka saw not just technique but philosophy embodied. Wallace noticed too. His eyes narrowed slightly, his bouncing less pronounced. "That old-school stance won't work against me," he said. But his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I eat traditional stylists for breakfast." Norris made no reply. His breathing remained calm and measured, his gaze steady. Decades of daily training had ingrained in him a physical intelligence that went beyond conscious thought. His body knew exactly where it needed to be, how much tension to hold, which muscles to engage. This wasn't the choreographed movement of his films, where outcomes were predetermined. This was the real expression of his art. Something in that steadiness seemed to unnerve Wallace. He feinted a jab, a probe, to test Norris's reactions. Norris didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move, not frozen or slow, but perfectly controlled waiting. The feint revealed more than Wallace intended. To the casual observer, it was just a quick, probing motion. But to Norris, it was a wealth of information. Wallace's weight distribution, his preferred angles, the telegraphing in his shoulder before movement, each detail catalogued and processed without conscious effort. Wallace feinted again, this time stepping forward with the movement. Again, Norris remained still, though somehow more intensely present than before. In the press section, Martin Kelly scribbled frantically, trying to capture what he was witnessing. "Static electricity," he wrote. "The air before lightning strikes." His editor would probably cut such poetic flourishes, but in this moment, technical analysis seemed inadequate to describe the tension crackling between these two men. "Fight me!" Wallace snapped, frustration breaking through his showman's facade. Norris's voice came quiet but clear. "You first." The simple response hung in the air between them. Not a taunt, not a challenge, just a statement of fact. But it carried an unmistakable message. "I'm not here to perform. I'm here to respond." Wallace's jaw tightened. He was accustomed to opponents who chased him, who reacted to his provocations, who fought on his terms. Norris was offering none of that. From his corner, Wallace's coach recognized the strategic problem unfolding. "Move, Bill," he called. "Create angles." But his advice, while technically sound, missed the deeper issue. This wasn't just a tactical challenge, it was a philosophical one. Wallace's entire approach, his reliance on provocative movement, psychological intimidation, and opponent reaction, was being neutralized not by superior technique, but by superior presence. The crowd sensed the psychological battle unfolding before the physical one had begun. The entire dynamic of the evening had shifted. Despite Wallace's earlier dominance, he suddenly appeared smaller somehow, less certain, while Norris seemed to occupy more space than his physical form should allow. Near the timekeeper's table, 3 executives from the television network huddled in urgent conversation. This unplanned confrontation was either a liability nightmare or ratings gold, possibly both. The program director was already signaling camera operators to reposition for better angles, while the legal representative reviewed waiver clauses in the broadcast contract. "Fine," Wallace muttered, more to himself than to Norris. "Have it your way." Without further warning, he exploded forward a blistering combination of jab, cross, left roundhouse kick, the same sequence that had dropped Slayton. His famous superfoot whipped through the air with blinding speed. A strike that few men could even see, let alone avoid. In that microsecond, as Wallace's leg accelerated toward its target, several things happened simultaneously. 3,000 spectators collectively gasped or held their breath. Dozens of cameras clicked in rapid succession. Slayton, still watching from near the tunnel, unconsciously touched his injured jaw, and Chuck Norris made his decision. The decision wasn't whether to block or dodge, those were merely technical options. The real decision was deeper: how to respond in a way that would serve the highest purpose of the martial arts. Not to humiliate Wallace, not to prove his own superiority, but to create a moment of genuine teaching. In the traditional dojos where Norris had begun his journey, combat was never just about winning. It was about truth. What happened next would be replayed on television for weeks, described in martial arts magazines for years, and debated in dojos for decades. Norris moved. The movement defied conventional description. It wasn't fast in the way Wallace's techniques were fast. A blur of athletic explosiveness. It was precise, economical, perfectly timed. As if Norris had solved a complex equation of time, space, and intention that allowed him to be exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. Wallace's kick, which had devastated countless opponents, passed through empty space as Norris shifted not backward in retreat, but slightly to the side. Just enough for the kick to miss by millimeters. So close that Wallace could feel the fabric of Norris's pants brush against his shin as the kick sliced past its target. No wasted motion, no dramatic leap, no flourish. Just perfectly timed efficiency. The crowd gasped collectively. Wallace's momentum carried him forward, momentarily off balance. A vulnerability almost imperceptible to untrained eyes, but glaringly obvious to a master like Norris. In that split second of vulnerability, Norris had multiple options. He could have countered with a devastating strike of his own. He could have swept Wallace's supporting leg, sending him crashing to the canvas. He could have clinched and thrown him all valid martial responses that would have demonstrated his superior skill. Yet Norris didn't counterattack. He simply reset his position, hands still raised in the same relaxed guard, expression unchanged. This choice to not capitalize on Wallace's vulnerability spoke volumes. It wasn't hesitation or uncertainty, it was deliberate restraint. A message more powerful than any physical technique. I could have ended this already, but that's not why I'm here. Wallace recovered quickly, professionalism overriding surprise. Lucky dodge, he muttered, circling again. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The arena remained hushed, the air electric with tension. Something primal in the collective consciousness recognized they weren't watching sport or entertainment anymore. This was something older, something fundamental about dominance and respect. In the VIP section, an aging boxing promoter leaned toward his companion. "I've seen 1,000 fights," he whispered. "Never seen nothing like this." His companion, a retired heavyweight, nodded silently. Both men recognized what was unfolding, not the trading of techniques, but the collision of approaches. Not who was better, but what was better. Wallace adjusted his strategy, recognizing that his usual tactics weren't working. He moved more deliberately now, his footwork more disciplined, his focus sharper. The showman was receding, the fighter emerging a transformation that would have been admirable under different circumstances. But even this more focused version of Wallace carried the momentum of his earlier approach. Years of habits, physical and psychological, couldn't be undone in moments. His fighting style was built on creating reactions, forcing opponents to respond to his initiative. Against Norris, who refused to play that game, Wallace found himself increasingly in uncharted territory. The seconds stretched into a full minute of heightened tension. No strikes thrown, no exchanges made. Just two men, in a silent dialogue of position and presence. For martial arts purists in the audience, this was as riveting as any exchange of blows, the physical manifestation of opposing philosophies, the tangible expression of different paths. As the tension built toward its inevitable release, something unexpected happened. A subtle shift came over Wallace's face. Not defeat or surrender, but a glimmer of recognition. For perhaps the first time in his career, he was being forced to confront not just an opponent, but a mirror reflecting his own approach to his art. In that moment of clarity, Wallace attacked again, not out of frustration this time, but out of a genuine desire to test himself against what Norris represented. This was no longer about humiliating an aging movie star or proving the superiority of his flashy style. It had become something more personal, more profound. A quest for truth. And as Wallace launched forward, committing himself fully to the encounter, Norris prepared to answer, not with words or ego, but with the physical wisdom accumulated through decades of dedicated practice. What would follow wouldn't just be a clash of bodies, but a conversation between traditions, old and new, flash and substance, arrogance and humility played out in the universal language of combat. The moment stretched and compressed simultaneously, one of those rare instances where time itself seems to bend to human will. Wallace's kick, his famed superfoot, that had devastated so many opponents, sliced through empty air as Norris shifted not backward in retreat, but slightly to the side, just enough for the kick to miss by millimeters. No wasted motion, no dramatic leap, no flourish, just perfectly timed efficiency. The crowd gasped collectively. Wallace's momentum carried him forward, momentarily off balance, a vulnerability almost imperceptible to untrained eyes, but glaringly obvious to a master like Norris. In that fraction of a second, Wallace felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine vulnerability. His body, so finely tuned and responsive, suddenly felt alien to him, overextended, exposed, unanchored. For a fighter whose entire identity was built on control and dominance, this momentary imbalance was more than physical, it was existential. Yet Norris didn't counterattack. He simply reset his position. Hands still raised in the same relaxed guard. Expression unchanged. This choice, this deliberate restraint, hung in the air between them, more profound than any strike could have been. Wallace recovered quickly, professionalism overriding surprise. Lucky dodge, he muttered, circling again. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. In the press section, Martin Kelly stopped writing mid-sentence, pen suspended above his notepad. 23 years of covering combat sports had taught him to recognize watershed moments, and this was undeniably one. What he had just witnessed wasn't simply technical skill, it was mastery, so complete it appeared effortless, almost inevitable. The arena remained hushed, the air electric with tension. Something primal in the collective consciousness recognized they weren't watching sport or entertainment anymore. This was something older, something fundamental about dominance and respect. 3 rows back from ringside, Master Tanaka nodded silently. The movement Norris had just executed wasn't flashy enough to make highlight reels, wasn't dramatic enough to sell tickets. It was something purer. The perfect expression of karate's core principle, maximum effect through minimum effort. To the uninitiated, it might have looked like Norris had simply stepped aside. To those who understood, it was poetry. Wallace attacked again, a flurry of punches followed by his signature left kick. Again, Norris's movement was minimal, but precisely calculated. He slipped the punches not by retreating or covering up, but by subtle shifts of his centerline, allowing each strike to pass within fractions of an inch of its target. When the kick came, he blocked it with his forearm, a simple motion that nevertheless absorbed the full force of Wallace's famous technique. The impact made a sharp cracking sound that echoed throughout the arena. Wallace's eyes widened slightly. Few men had simply stood and blocked his kick. Fewer still had done so, without flinching. That block told Wallace something crucial. Norris wasn't just avoiding confrontation. He was selecting his engagements with surgical precision. The block hadn't been desperate or reactive, it had been deliberate. Chosen over evasion for a specific purpose. A message delivered through contact rather than words. I can absorb your power without being moved by it. That all you gonna do? That all you gonna do? A message. A message. That all you gonna do? Wallace taunted, masking his growing frustration. Dodge and block? This ain't point karate, Chuck. Norris remained silent, his breathing steady, his focus absolute. In his stillness lay an answer Wallace didn't want to hear. I don't need to attack you. You're defeating yourself. This silent response pierced deeper than any verbal comeback could have. Wallace had built his career on provoking reactions, emotional, physical, verbal. His fights were as much psychological as physical, breaking opponents down through intimidation and mockery before finishing them with technical brilliance. Against Norris, this approach wasn't just failing. It was being rendered irrelevant. In the VIP section, a retired heavyweight champion leaned toward his companion. Look at Norris's eyes, he whispered. Never blinks. Never looks away. Never rushes. Seen that look before. Man who knows exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it. His companion, a boxing promoter who had made millions selling spectacle over substance, nodded reluctantly. Wallace is fighting. Norris is teaching, he replied. Question is whether the kid's smart enough to learn. Wallace pressed forward again, this time with a more complex combination, feinting high, striking low, mixing rhythms to create openings. His technique was beautiful. A display of everything that had made him champion. Against any other opponent, it would have been devastating. Against Norris, it was insufficient. Each strike met empty air or solid block. Norris moved like water around stone, not evading in fear, but simply not being where the attacks landed. No wasted energy, no unnecessary movement. Just pure, distilled efficiency born from decades of rigorous practice. For the martial artists scattered throughout the audience, This was a masterclass in the difference between technique and understanding. Wallace's movements were technically flawless, textbook perfection, executed at breathtaking speed. But Norris was operating at a deeper level. One where technique had been transcended, where movement emerged from profound understanding rather than conscious thought. 2 minutes into the confrontation, sweat began to drip from Wallace's forehead. His breathing grew heavier, his movements fractionally slower. By contrast, Norris remained dry, his breathing unchanged, his eyes clear and focused. The physical differences were becoming apparent to everyone watching. Wallace, for all his conditioning, was working hard, muscles tensing, lungs laboring, each technique requiring effort. Norris seemed to exist in a different relationship with physical reality, conserving energy not through inaction but through perfect efficiency. The crowd sensed the shift. Some began to chant again, "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Wallace heard it too. His face flushed with a cocktail of exertion and humiliation. The narrative was slipping away from him. The young champion schooling the aging movie star had somehow transformed into its opposite. In his corner, Wallace's coach recognized the dangerous psychological territory his fighter was entering. "Stay focused, Bill," he called out. "Work your game." But what was Wallace's game now? His usual approach, overwhelming opponents with speed and flashy techniques, while breaking them mentally with mockery, had proven ineffective. For perhaps the first time in his professional career, he was being forced to adapt mid-fight, to reinvent himself under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. "Fight back!" Wallace demanded, frustration breaking through his composure. "Throw a punch. Kick. Do something." The demand revealed more than Wallace intended. It exposed his fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. He still believed this was a conventional fight, one man attacking, the other defending, both seeking to dominate through superior technique. He hadn't yet grasped that Norris was engaged in something altogether different. Norris's reply was so quiet that only Wallace and those nearest the ring could hear it. "I am." The simple statement carried profound truth. In refusing to engage on Wallace's terms, in maintaining his composure while Wallace exhausted himself physically and emotionally, Norris was indeed fighting, just not in the way Wallace recognized or respected. This statement, these two quiet words, hit Wallace with more impact than any physical blow could have. They challenged not just his fighting approach, but his entire understanding of combat. The possibility dawned on him that he had been measuring success by the wrong metrics all along. Something shifted in Wallace then, a microscopic change in his eyes that only someone of Norris's experience could have detected. Not surrender, not even respect yet, but the first glimmer of genuine questioning. The seedling of humility, taking root in soil previously too hard to penetrate. Yet this moment of potential enlightenment was quickly overwhelmed by years of ingrained habits and the raw emotion of the moment. Professional control gave way to raw impulse. Wallace launched forward with a wild combination, all power. Minimal technique, the kind of attack he would have mocked in another fighter. It was the opening Norris had been waiting for. As Wallace overextended on a looping right hook, Norris finally moved with attacking intent. His counter was simple. A straight punch to the solar plexus, executed with textbook precision, not thrown with hatred or even with full power, but placed exactly where it needed to be, when it needed to be there. The punch landed with a dull thud that seemed to resonate through the entire arena. Wallace froze mid-motion, eyes widening in shock more than pain. The air left his lungs in a harsh gasp. In the shocked silence that followed, veteran fighters in the audience recognized what they had just witnessed. That single strike contained everything that separated these two men. Wallace fought to defeat opponents. Norris moved to express truth. Wallace's techniques were designed to impress. Norris's were refined to be essential. One man performed martial arts, the other embodied them. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Wallace stood suspended in his attack, Norris with arm extended in his counter, the crowd collectively holding their breath. A perfect tableau of cause and effect, action and consequence. Then Wallace staggered backward, one hand instinctively clutching his midsection. He tried to maintain his fighting stance, but his body betrayed him. His previous fluid movement now looked stiff, forced. The physical impact of the punch was significant. Norris's decades of conditioning had created striking power that belied his calm delivery. But the psychological impact was far greater. In that single exchange, Wallace had been forced to confront the hollowness of his previous certainty. The gap between his perception of himself and reality had been bridged in the most immediate, undeniable way possible. Norris returned to his ready position, still offering no taunt, no celebration, no acknowledgement of advantage gained. His focus remained absolute, his breathing controlled. This wasn't about domination. It was about demonstration. In the crowd, the chanting had stopped, replaced by a reverent hush. Even the most casual spectators sensed they were witnessing something transcendent, not just a confrontation between fighters, but a collision between philosophies, between approaches to life itself. Wallace, pride overriding wisdom, pushed through his discomfort and attacked again. This time his movements were compromised. The earlier speed and precision diminished by pain and dawning realization. Norris blocked a jab, sidestepped a kick, then countered with a simple front kick to Wallace's lead knee, not delivered to injure, but to disrupt balance. Wallace stumbled, nearly fell, then righted himself with visible effort. Again, the choice of technique revealed deeper intent. Norris could have targeted vulnerable areas, the ribs already tender from his first strike, the exposed jaw as Wallace overextended. Instead, he had chosen a technique that demonstrated without damaging, that taught without humiliating. The crowd was fully invested now, the arena humming with tense energy. They were witnessing something few had seen: Superfoot Wallace being systematically dismantled not through superior athleticism or flashy technique, but through fundamental mastery of the martial arts. In the third row, Master Tanaka watched with a small, knowing smile. What Norris was displaying wasn't just technical superiority, it was the manifestation of Bushido, the warrior's code that transcended technique. Every movement, every choice revealed character. Not just how to fight, but how to be. Wallace knew it too. His face showed a complex mixture of emotions: frustration, confusion, and something new: respect, tinged with fear. Not fear of injury, but fear of what was being revealed about himself. For years, Wallace had defined himself through physical dominance and public persona. He was Superfoot, the undefeated champion, the showman who backed his talk with devastating technique. Now, in the harsh clarity of this unexpected confrontation, that identity was being challenged at its foundation. He reset his stance and circled more cautiously now. "Lucky shots," he muttered. But the bravado had drained from his voice. No one in the arena believed it. Least of all, Wallace himself. There had been nothing lucky about Norris's movements. Each had been precisely chosen, perfectly executed, surgically targeted, to make a specific point. Norris remained silent, patient, present. His strategy was becoming clear to those with eyes, to see he was allowing Wallace to confront his own limitations, to experience firsthand the difference between showmanship and mastery. In the press section, Martin Kelly continued writing furiously. Tomorrow's headline had already formed in his mind: Norris schools Superfoot in lesson on martial arts philosophy. His editor would hate it too long, too cerebral for sports pages, but nothing less could capture what was unfolding before him. Wallace, desperate to reclaim the narrative, gathered himself for one final assault. This would be different, he silently promised himself. No wild swings, no emotional reactions. He would show Norris that he too understood control, precision, timing. Drawing on everything he had learned throughout his career, Wallace launched his most technical combination yet. It was beautiful to behold a masterful sequence of feints, strikes, and positional adjustments executed with everything he had left. For a moment, it seemed he might break through Norris's defense. In this sequence was Wallace's statement, his own wordless communication. "I am not just flash and arrogance. I too have substance. I too have studied. I too am a martial artist." Norris received this message with perfect clarity. His response would define not just this encounter, but potentially Wallace's relationship with his art going forward. He slipped the final punch, stepped into Wallace's space, and delivered 3 rapid strikes, a palm heel to the chest, an elbow to the shoulder that turned Wallace slightly, and finally, a sweep that took Wallace's legs from under him. The sequence unfolded with such smooth precision that it appeared choreographed. Wallace hit the canvas with a thud that seemed to echo the earlier fall of Slayton, a perfect narrative symmetry that was lost on no one present. But there was a crucial difference. Where Slayton had been demolished through brute force and showy technique, Wallace had been dismantled through economy and precision. Where Slayton had been mocked in defeat, Wallace was being offered a different path. For a moment, Wallace lay there, stunned more by the efficiency of the takedown than by its impact. His body ached, but it was his pride that had taken the more significant blow. The fall itself hadn't been particularly hard. Norris had controlled the sweep to demonstrate rather than damage. Even in this final exchange, there had been restraint, respect, teaching rather than punishment. Norris stood over him, not in triumph or domination, but in simple readiness. He extended a hand not to continue fighting, but to help Wallace up. It was a gesture that contained the entire philosophy that separated these two fighters. Combat without cruelty, victory without humiliation, strength without arrogance. In that extended hand was an invitation not just to stand again, but to rise in a different way than Wallace had fallen. To understand that true martial arts was never about dominating others, but about mastering oneself. Around the ring, 3,000 spectators watched in silence, collectively holding their breath. The television camera zoomed in tight, capturing a moment that transcended sport. The announcers, for once, fell silent, recognizing that commentary would only diminish what was unfolding. Wallace stared at the extended hand, his breathing ragged, sweat dripping from his face onto the canvas. In his eyes, a complex storm of emotions battled: pride that wanted to reject the offer, anger that sought to lash out, humiliation that wished to retreat. But beneath these immediate reactions, something deeper was stirring, a recognition that would take time to fully process, but had already begun to take root. The recognition that in this defeat, Wallace had been offered something far more valuable than another victory could ever have been. He had been offered truth. Wallace stared at the extended hand, his breathing ragged, sweat dripping from his face onto the canvas. In his eyes, a complex storm of emotions battled: pride, anger, humiliation, and beneath it all, a dawning recognition. The hand before him represented something his own victories had never offered: dignity in defeat. The arena held its breath. 3,000 people, moments ago roaring with partisan energy, now unified in witnessing something transcendent. This was no longer about fighting techniques or personal grudges. It had evolved into a moment of profound human truth. From his vantage point in the press section, Martin Kelly stopped writing altogether. In 23 years of covering combat sports, he had documented thousands of victories and defeats, but never a moment like this where the outcome of physical contest seemed secondary to the spiritual transformation it had catalyzed. Next to him, a young photographer whispered, "Should I be taking pictures? This feels almost private." Kelly nodded, without looking away from the ring. "Take them. People need to see this. Not just the fight. This moment, right here." At ringside, Jack Pomeroy, Wallace's longtime promoter, watched with a complex mixture of emotions. The businessman in him calculated the financial implications of his star fighters, humbling the potentially lost endorsements, the renegotiated appearance fees, the narrative shift in future promotional materials. But those concerns felt strangely distant, overshadowed by the raw humanity of the scene unfolding before him. 25 years in this business, he murmured to no one in particular, and I've never seen anything like this. After what felt like eternity, but was merely seconds, Wallace reached up and grasped Norris's hand. The simple gesture released a wave of tension throughout the arena. It wasn't just Wallace accepting help, it was Wallace acknowledging something fundamental about himself and about the martial arts he had practiced for so long, but perhaps never fully understood. Norris pulled him to his feet with steady strength. No words were exchanged immediately, but something passed between them. An understanding older than language. A respect, forged in honest confrontation. Wallace stood, slightly unsteady, one hand still reflexively touching his midsection where Norris's first counter had landed. Though no serious damage had been done, the psychological impact of that strike continued to reverberate through him. For perhaps the first time in his professional career, Wallace felt genuinely outclassed, not by superior athleticism or even by technical skill, but by something deeper, something more fundamental. The crowd erupted, not with the bloodthirsty fervor of combat spectators, but with the appreciative recognition of having witnessed something authentic and rare. The applause rolled through Caesar's palace like thunder, building rather than diminishing as the significance of the moment settled over everyone present. Among those clapping most enthusiastically was a group of martial arts instructors who had traveled from across the country for the exhibition. For them, what they had just witnessed wasn't simply an impressive display of fighting skills, but a powerful validation of the principles they taught daily in humble dojos. Far from the glitz of Las Vegas principles about humility, discipline, and the true purpose of martial study that often seemed increasingly antiquated in an era of flashy commercialization. "That," said one instructor to his colleagues, his voice thick with emotion, "is what we've been trying to explain to our students for years." Reporters scribbled frantically. Photographers' cameras clicked in rapid succession. Television cameramen zoomed in on the two fighters, standing face to face in the center of the ring. The young champion humbled, the older master vindicated. Yet vindication wasn't quite right. Nothing in Norris's demeanor suggested triumph or satisfaction at Wallace's humbling. There was no gloating, no strutting, no playing to the crowd. His expression remained calm, his posture relaxed, but dignified. This hadn't been about winning for him. It had been about truth. Wallace, his characteristic bravado stripped away, finally spoke. "I underestimated you." His voice was quiet, meant for Norris rather than the crowd. Norris's response was equally private. "No, you overestimated yourself." The simple truth of it hit Wallace with more impact than any physical strike. He nodded once, swallowing hard, then stepped back. For perhaps the first time in his career, he stood in a ring without performing, without playing to the crowd, just a man facing the reality of his limitations. Master Tanaka, observing from his seat, nodded in quiet approval. What he was witnessing wasn't just the conclusion of a physical contest, but the beginning of a spiritual journey. In traditional martial arts philosophy, true progress often began with exactly this kind of humbling. The stripping away of ego to reveal the authentic self beneath. The real fight, Tanaka murmured to himself, starts now. Near the tunnel, Slayton watched intently, his jaw throbbing but momentarily forgotten. There was no schadenfreude in his observation, no satisfaction in seeing Wallace humbled as he had been humbled. Instead, there was a strange sense of connection. Both of them had been taught the same lesson tonight, though in very different ways. In the VIP section, a movie producer leaned toward his companion. "We couldn't script this if we tried," he said. "No one would believe it." His companion, a veteran fight promoter, nodded. "Because it's real. That's the difference. Everything else in this town is an illusion. What we just saw was truth." Norris turned toward the ropes, ready to exit. As quietly as he had entered, his purpose had been accomplished. Not to defeat Wallace, any number of fighters might have been capable of that on the right day, but to create a moment of potential transformation, to offer a mirror in which Wallace might see himself clearly for the first time. But Wallace called after him, loud enough now to be heard beyond the ring. "Wait." Norris paused, turning back. The crowd, which had been cheering continuously, gradually fell silent again, sensing another significant moment unfolding. In that silence, the sound of Wallace's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as he crossed the distance between them. Wallace's face reflected an internal struggle. The battle between the persona he had cultivated for years and the authentic self that had been awakened through this confrontation. Every step across the canvas represented movement not just in physical space, but in psychological territory. Crossing from who he had been toward who he might become. In that moment, memories cascaded through Wallace's mind, his first martial arts class as a teenager. The thrill of early tournament victories. The gradual shift from seeking excellence to seeking acclaim. The slow compromise of principles in pursuit of fame and fortune. He saw with sudden clarity how far he had strayed from the path he had originally set out to follow. When he reached Norris, Wallace made a decision that surprised even himself. With deliberate, conscious intent, he bowed a formal, traditional bow of the kind he had earlier mocked. Not theatrical or exaggerated, but genuine student to master. The gesture silenced the arena once more. Even those with no martial arts background recognized the profound significance of this act. It wasn't just courtesy. It was acknowledgement. It wasn't just respect. It was transformation made visible. Norris returned the bow with equal formality and respect. In that shared motion was a recognition of something that transcended their differences, the spirit of martial arts that, at its core, was about growth rather than dominance. Wisdom rather than power. When they straightened, Wallace asked, "Would you teach me sometime?" A small smile, the first emotion Norris had displayed all evening, briefly crossed his face. "Not teaching," he replied quietly. "Learning together." The cameras couldn't capture the weight of this exchange, but those close enough to hear it understood its significance. Wallace nodded, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face, humility, gratitude, and something like relief. In that moment, something crystallized for Wallace. The realization that all his victories, all his titles, all his public acclaim had brought him fame, but not fulfillment. The understanding that in his focus on defeating others, he had neglected the more important battle with himself. The recognition that the martial arts were not just techniques for fighting, but a path toward becoming more fully human. Norris turned and ducked between the ropes, descending from the ring with the same measured calm with which he had entered it. No victory lap, no acknowledgement of the chants that had resumed. Chuck. 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 His work was done. As he made his way down the aisle toward the exit, a young boy, no more than 10 years old, leaned over the barrier, wide-eyed with admiration. "Mr. Norris," he called. "That was amazing." Norris paused, placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, and spoke quietly. "Remember what you saw. Not the fighting, the respect." The boy nodded solemnly, clearly storing the moment away as something precious. Norris continued on, passing Slayton, who had managed to make his way to the aisle. Their eyes met briefly, a wordless exchange between two men who understood the deeper currents of what had transpired tonight. "Thank you," Slayton said simply, his words slightly slurred from his swollen jaw. Norris acknowledged him with a slight nod, then continued toward the tunnel that led backstage, leaving behind an arena forever changed by his brief presence. In the press section, reporters were already crafting headlines. "Norris schools Superfoot in impromptu showdown," and "Traditional carrot vindicated in Vegas clash." Photographers reviewed their shots, knowing they had captured something historic, not just a confrontation between fighters, but a moment when the soul of martial arts had been laid bare for all to witness. Television producers huddled with network executives, already planning special segments and highlight packages. "This is gold," one executive murmured. "Absolute gold." But even as they discussed marketing opportunities, there was an unusual note of reverence in their voices, a recognition that they had witnessed something that transcended commerce. Wallace remained in the ring longer than necessary, his usual eagerness to work the crowd noticeably absent. He stared at the canvas, then at his hands, then at Norris's retreating back. Something fundamental had shifted in him, not broken, but rearranged. His coach climbed through the ropes, approaching cautiously, unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar version of his fighter. "Bill, you okay? Need the medic?" Wallace shook his head. "I'm fine. Not hurt." He paused, then added, "Not physically. Anyway." The coach, a former fighter himself, recognized the look in Wallace's eyes. "It happens to all of us sooner or later. Meeting someone who makes us question everything." "He didn't beat me," Wallace said, though without conviction. "Not really." "No." The coach agreed, surprising Wallace. "He taught you. Bigger thing, in the long run." The promoter, sensing the need to move the program forward, signaled for the next exhibition to begin preparations. Wallace finally exited the ring, passing his coach without further comment, heading directly to the locker room. The swagger was gone from his walk, replaced by a thoughtful, almost meditative gait. As he moved through the crowd, Wallace noticed something unexpected. There was none of the mockery or schadenfreude he might have anticipated after such a public humbling. Instead, he saw something closer to respect in the eyes that met his, not for his fighting prowess now, but for his willingness to acknowledge defeat with dignity, to bow in genuine respect. Near the tunnel, a veteran martial artist reached out to touch Wallace's arm as he passed. "Tonight," the older man said quietly, "you became a true martial artist." The words hit Wallace with unexpected force. Throughout his career, he had been called many things: champion, superstar, showman, but never before had such a simple recognition felt so meaningful. In the tunnel, away from the public eye, Wallace encountered several fighters scheduled for later exhibitions. They stepped aside respectfully, offering nods that contained neither pity nor mockery, just acknowledgement of a fellow traveler on a difficult path. Wallace pushed through the locker room door, seeking solitude to process the evening's events. The space was empty except for a single figure, Slayton, who had made his way back through side corridors, seated on a bench with an ice pack pressed to his swollen jaw. Their eyes met the man Wallace had brutalized and mocked earlier. the catalyst for the confrontation that had just transformed his understanding of himself and his art. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "James," Wallace finally said, using Slayton's first name for the first time ever. "I." He stopped, the words, "I'm sorry." Unfamiliar territory for a man accustomed to making others apologize to him. Slayton removed the ice pack, revealing the dark bruising already forming along his jawline. "Save it," he said, his words slightly slurred from swelling. "What happened out there that was worth this?" He gestured to his injury. "Some lessons come harder than others." Wallace nodded, understanding flowing between them. Both had been schooled tonight, each in their own way. "What did he say to you?" Slayton asked. "At the end." Wallace hesitated. The exchange with Norris, feeling almost too personal to share. But something in Slayton's eyes, a genuine desire to understand rather than to judge, made him answer. "He said we'd be learning together," Wallace replied. "Not him teaching me." Slayton considered this, then nodded slowly. "That's how it works with the real ones. They never stop being students themselves." The insight surprised Wallace not just for its wisdom, but for the fact that it came from a man he had dismissed as irrelevant just hours earlier. Another assumption shattered. Another perspective shifted. "I've been doing this all wrong," Wallace said quietly, the admission feeling both painful and liberating. "No," Slayton countered. "You've been doing it exactly how you needed to get to this moment. That's how paths work. They take us where we need to go, even when we think we're going somewhere else." Before Wallace could respond, the locker room door opened, and his promoter entered, already in damage control mode. "Bill, we need to talk strategy. I've got reporters waiting. We need to frame this the right way. I'm thinking we emphasize the exhibition nature of it. Maybe suggest you weren't going full out. Keeping it professional for the fans." Wallace held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No," he said firmly. "No spin. No excuses. I got beat by a better martial artist. That's the story." The promoter stared, momentarily speechless. This wasn't the Bill Wallace he knew, the carefully cultivated superfoot persona who never showed weakness, never admitted doubt. "Bill," he said carefully, "I'm thinking about your brand here. Your future bookings. Your reputation." Wallace laughed, a genuine sound, devoid of the usual performative quality his public laughter carried. "My reputation? My reputation should be as a martial artist who respects the truth, including the truth about himself." The promoter opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it, sensing the futility. Something had changed in his starfighter, something fundamental and, he suspected, irreversible. "Your call," he said finally. "Press conference in 30 minutes. Main lobby." He departed, already mentally drafting a new promotional strategy for this unexpected version of Bill Wallace. Slayton stood with some effort, wincing as he moved. "I should get to the hospital," he said. "Get this jaw looked at properly." Wallace nodded. "Let me cover that. And the follow-up treatment." It wasn't a grandiose gesture of charity or a public relations move, just a simple acknowledgement of responsibility, of connection. "Appreciated," Slayton said simply. He moved toward the door, then paused. "He'll be gone by now, you know." "Norris. He's not the type to stick around for accolades." Wallace nodded. He had sensed this already. "Will I see him again?" "If you're supposed to," Slayton replied. "That's how it works with catalysts. They show up when needed, then disappear until the next time." With that cryptic observation, he departed, leaving Wallace alone with his thoughts. Backstage, Norris was indeed preparing to leave. Politely, but firmly declining all interview requests. He collected his jacket from where it had been carefully hung, slipped it on, and headed toward the exit. He was nearly there when a voice called from behind. "Norris." He turned to find Wallace, still in his fighting shorts, a towel around his neck, face flushed from exertion and emotion. The younger fighter had clearly rushed to catch him before he left. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two men who had connected in the most primal, yet profound way possible. Then Wallace extended his hand, not for a martial arts bow this time, but for a simple, human handshake. "Thank you," he said, voice rough with sincerity. Norris accepted the handshake, his grip firm but not dominating. "Remember tonight," he said quietly. "Not what happened to you, but what happened in you." Wallace's brow furrowed as he processed these words. Words that would echo in his mind for years to come. Words that would fundamentally reshape his approach not just to martial arts but to life itself. Norris didn't wait for a response. With a slight nod, he turned and walked through the exit into the cool desert night. Outside, Las Vegas continued its perpetual carnival lights flashing, music blaring, fortunes being made and lost with every roll of the dice. Norris paused, letting the contrast wash over him, the artificial chaos of the strip versus the clarity he had just experienced in the ring. A waiting car pulled up, the driver opening the door without being asked. As Norris settled into the back seat, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. The same man who had entered the arena hours earlier, yet somehow more himself. "Where to, Mr. Norris?" the driver asked. "Airport," he replied. "I've done what I came to do." As the car pulled away from Caesar's Palace, merging into the neon-lit traffic of the Strip, Norris knew the story of tonight would grow and change with each retelling. By morning, it would be in newspapers. By next week, in martial arts magazines. Eventually, it would become something between legend and parable, the night when flash confronted substance, when arrogance met mastery, when a young champion learned that true power lies not in domination, but in self-control. But none of that mattered to Chuck Norris. What mattered was simpler, more essential. Tonight, the martial arts he had dedicated his life to had been tested not in tournament or in film, but in the raw crucible of human conflict. And they had proven to be what he had always believed. Not just techniques for fighting, but a path toward becoming better than our baser instincts. A way to find strength in restraint and victory in wisdom. As Vegas receded in the rear window, Norris closed his eyes, letting the evening settle into memory. He had not come seeking confrontation or vindication. He had not thrown a single punch in anger. Yet somehow, he had fought one of the most important battles of his career, not for trophies or titles or even personal pride, but for something far more valuable. The soul of an art form he loved, and the future of a young fighter who had lost his way. In the quiet of the car, Chuck Norris allowed himself another small smile. Sometimes, the most powerful statement is the one made without words. Sometimes, the most important victory is the one that looks nothing like winning. And sometimes, the true measure of mastery is not in how many opponents you defeat, but in how many you help to rise. Back at Caesar's Palace, Wallace stood before the gathered press, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. The questions came rapid fire. "Bill, what happened out there? Will there be a rematch? Do you think Norris had an unfair advantage? How does this affect your undefeated record?" Wallace raised a hand, silencing the clamor. The reporters, accustomed to his usual brash, quotable responses, leaned forward eagerly. "Tonight," Wallace began, his voice steady and thoughtful, "I learned what martial arts is really about. Not from winning, but from losing. Not from talking, but from listening. Not from showing off, but from showing up. He paused, gathering words for concepts he was still processing. Chuck Norris didn't beat me tonight. He showed me who I could be, who I should be. The press room fell silent. These were not the words they had expected, not the narrative they had prepared to report. That's all I have to say, Wallace concluded. Except this. From now on, you'll see a different fighter in the ring, a different man. With that, he stepped away from the microphones, ignoring the shouted follow-up questions, and walked out of the press room with a new purpose in his stride. That night, alone in his hotel room, Wallace sat in quiet meditation, a practice he had abandoned years ago in favor of more physically dynamic training. In the stillness, he found himself returning to Norris's parting words. Remember tonight. Not what happened to you, but what happened in you. What had happened in him. A shattering, certainly of ego, of illusion, of the carefully constructed persona of Superfoot Wallace. But also, a beginning. The first step on a path he had once known but had strayed from in pursuit of fame and fortune. Tomorrow, he would train differently. He would think differently. He would fight differently. And years later, when young fighters came to him seeking only glory and dominance, he would tell them the story of the night he learned what it truly means to be a martial artist, not from victory or defeat, but from the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to prove and showed him everything that mattered. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.